traditional territory of the Coast Salish people, particularly the Duwamish. We thank them for our continued use of the natural resources of their ancestral homeland. Thank you all for tuning in. Town Hall is proud to be a community-focused organization, a place where we can share and sustain ideas and creativity, even if we can't gather in person. I'd like to thank Jonathan for appearing tonight to help make that possible. Town Hall will continue to produce virtual content this fall, including our podcast, In the Moment, which features exclusive guests. And many of our past talks are available in video or podcast form in our digital media library. Town Hall is adding new events and podcasts every day. Upcoming programs include Senator Chris Murphy about America and our relationship with gun violence, Aaron Brockovich about our national water crisis, Ambassador Capricia Marshall about the power of diplomacy, and more. Town Hall and the nonprofit community at large has been put under significant strain due to event cancellations and the ever-changing landscape. We hope you will consider extending your generosity to help support us during this difficult time by making a donation or becoming a member. Click on the donate button at the bottom of your screen, or you can make a donation online or text Town Hall to 44321 to give. Our partner booksellers have been hit by the negative effects of the COVID outbreak as well and can use your support. We encourage you to support local independent bookstores by purchasing a copy of the book being presented tonight. Use the link on this live stream page to purchase through Elliott Bay Books. For viewers who want to watch this broadcast with closed captioning, we recommend viewing the stream via our YouTube page linked here in the chat. To enable real-time closed captioning, click the CC button in the bottom right corner of the video player. The video will be available for rewatching immediately following tonight's broadcast. Tonight's presentation will be about 45 minutes, followed by Q&A. We will select questions from those submitted in the Ask a Question field at the bottom center of your screen. You can also vote on which questions will be addressed by clicking the arrow next to the question to upvote it. We can't guarantee we'll be able to address every question, but we will try to get to as many as possible. Please keep your questions concise and in the form of a question. Town Hall's work is made possible through your support and the support of our sponsors. Our Arnold Matulski Science Series is supported by Microsoft, KUOW, Wyncote Foundation Northwest, and the taxpayers of Washington. Finally, Town Hall is a member-supported organization, so I'd like to thank all of our members watching tonight. Jonathan Berman is assistant professor in the Department of Basic Sciences at NYIT-COM, Arkansas. Prior to joining New York Institute of Technology in 2019, he taught physiology, biology, and endocrinology at institutes close to San Antonio, where he was completing research. He earned his PhD in physiology in 2015 and carried out postdoctoral studies at the University of Texas Health Science Center, where he researched renal physiology and the molecular mechanicism underlying hypertension. His research continues to focus on those molecular mechanicisms as well as blood pressure regulation at the molecular, organismal, and population levels. An active science communicator, he served as national co-chair of the 2017 March for Science, host of the unveiling of the world's largest periodic table of elements, and science fair judge. He believes that science deniers aren't people who hate science, they're people who don't understand it. And the key to fighting that is building academic environments that foster passionate advocacy for science. His writing has been featured on New Scientist, Harvard Business Review, TEDx San Antonio, and others. Anti-Vaxxers, How to Change a Misinformation Movement is Berman's first book and the subject of tonight's talk. Please join me in welcoming Jonathan Berman.
Hello, thank you for having me. So, as she said, I'm Jonathan Berman. Let me get my slides up. So you should be able to see my slides. So the first thing I want to do is set some expectations. I'm not going to go over the science of vaccines or work to convince you that they're safe and effective. These are givens. This is a talk about the anti-vaccine movement, how we can understand them and maybe even change some of their minds. I spent about 3 years writing a book about anti-vaxxers. Coincidentally, has the same name as this talk, for sale today. And that's not a normal thing people do. So why did I do this? Well, the project started when I was working as a national co-chair on the March for Science, and I would encounter people who, in the same breath, would argue that we need to listen to science when it comes to global climate change, and then repeat anti-vaccine tropes. And it was fascinating to me that someone who was well-educated and, by their own description, pro-science would hold anti-vaccine or anti-science views. It's a fascinating contradiction. So, so in this picture, that's me. So the first question we need to ask ourselves are anti-vaccinators even a problem worth addressing? They're wrong. But there are people who are wrong about lots of things without needing an intervention. There are people who believe in Bigfoot, and they're probably wrong, but they're not hurting anyone. For the most part, vaccine coverage in the United States is pretty good. As of 2016, it exceeded targets for diphtheria, tetanus, pertussis, poliovirus, measles, mumps, rubella, Haemophilus influenza B, Hep B, varicella, Hep A, and rotavirus. And for the most part, people agree that vaccines are important and safe. Here you see a map of the world showing the percentage of people who agree that vaccines are important for children to have. So, and that's been pretty stable over the last 10 years. The majority of under-vaccination is predicted by socioeconomic status, age, and race, not anti-vaccine beliefs. And this would surprise most people. Most people underestimate the number of people who are vaccinated. So here, people were asked what percentage of people are vaccinated, of children are vaccinated against measles, and the majority far underestimate the fraction of people who were vaccinated against measles. In the U.S., by state, almost every state was at or above targets for most childhood vaccinations, including Washington. The rates of people seeking philosophical belief exemptions tend to be pretty low as well, less than 5%. Meanwhile, progress is being made still in eliminating vaccine-preventable diseases, just as we recently saw with the news of wild polio and elimination in Africa. Here we see some of the progress being made in reducing and eliminating measles. However, when we poll people, the number of people with doubts about the safety of various vaccines, and here I will apologize, because in this talk I'm going to sometimes have to refer to vaccines broadly as a category, even though we're really talking about a bunch of different things, because we're talking about what anti-vaxxers believe, and they tend to lump all vaccines together. So a much higher proportion of the population expresses doubts about the safety of vaccines, despite a large portion of the population being vaccinated. So there's an intention behavior gap. People have doubts about vaccines, but they're still getting vaccinated anyway for the most part. These kinds of intention behavior gaps happen all the time. Smokers know that smoking is bad for them, but they still smoke. I know I shouldn't eat too much pasta, but then I eat too much pasta. So there's other factors going into parents' decisions about whether to vaccinate their children than just their doubts. They have a complicated risk assessment going on that ties into their culture, their self-image, and their social ties. I'll give you an example of what I mean. 2 vaccines for diseases that can be sexually transmitted and can cause cancers: hepatitis B and HPV. Hep B was added to routine childhood vaccination schedules in the 1990s without much trouble. HPV vaccine has faced significant backlash, especially from religious groups. When Merck brought Gardasil to market, they started a lobbying campaign to convince states to make it mandatory for young girls, but not young boys. Religious groups believed that Gardasil would encourage young women to engage in sexual intercourse outside of marriage, which is something they were opposed to. Merck's lobbying sat wrong with those groups because it didn't take their cultural views into account. Another complication is, despite the overall high rates of vaccination in the US, there are some enclaves, we'll call enclaves, where vaccination rates have dropped quite low. In private schools, vaccine coverage for MMR might be as low as 83%. And the 2017 Minnesota measles outbreak, primarily among Somali Americans, is an example of a smaller group where vaccine coverage dropped and an outbreak resulted. Likewise, in 2019, Seems like such a long time ago now. There was a measles outbreak that also started in a smaller religious community. Children in some states with high rates of homeschooling, which are often left out of these statistics, or high rates of education at private schools, are particularly at risk of outbreaks. Moreover, with the current pandemic and the partisanization of mask wearing, we might expect significant opposition once a vaccine against SARS-CoV-2 becomes available. So when we try to understand this problem of anti-vaxxers, we have to understand they've had some success in creating doubt, and that's led to some problems, but they're still largely a fringe movement. When we address the doubts they've created, we need to understand that we're not just correcting factual errors. I call that the information deficit model of science communication, and it won't be enough. We need to learn about how people arrived at their risk assessment and what roles their communities and identity played in it. I think it's important at this point to distinguish three groups: the undervaccinated, the anti-vaxxer, and the vaccine hesitant. Not only are there differences in belief and commitment between these groups, there are demographic differences as well. A 2017 study of online anti-vaccination activists by Naomi Smith and Tim Graham found that women outnumbered men 3-1, even more so among the most active anti-vaxxers. However, a 2015 Pew survey of the vaccine hesitant found that men were slightly more likely than women to have concerns about the MMR vaccine, 11% compared to 8%. Anti-vaccine Twitter activity tends to associate with California, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, and Pennsylvania, and among women who recently gave birth, houses with high income levels, men aged 40 to 44, and men with minimal college education. Well, what about the undervaccinated? According to a 2004 study, somewhat old, by Smith, Chu, and Barker, the undervaccinated tended to be Black, have a younger mother who was not married and did not have a college degree, and to live in a household near the poverty level and to live in a central city, while unvaccinated children tended to be white and have a mother who was married and had a college degree, to live in a household with an annual income exceeding $75,000, and to have parents who expressed concerns regarding the safety of vaccines and indicated that medical doctors have little influence over vaccination decisions for their children. It bears consideration that someone who has vaccine doubts or poor access to vaccination probably has a different set of needs than a dedicated anti-vaxxer. We might expect that someone who doesn't have access to vaccines, it might be possible to get them up to date by providing access to a mobile vaccine clinic. Someone who just has doubts might be someone who's heard some things and needs to be reassured or have some questions answered. When people have a high level of commitment to a belief, that's when that belief can be especially hard to change. A lot of the time, and I want to address a myth here that tends to come up when people talk about vaccines and anti-vaxxers. A lot of the time, the anti-vaccine movement is traced only as far back as 1998 with Andrew Wakefield's paper. However, it really goes back a lot farther than that, back to the start of vaccines. So years before Jenner studied vaccination, there was a farmer named Benjamin Jesty. And this was in an era when smallpox ran rampant. Smallpox had been around at least since ancient Egypt. There were mummies found with smallpox scars, and it killed about 10% of the population. And you were going to have it probably at some point in your life. Many people were blinded or had lifelong scars, and the best thing people could do was something called variolation. Someone would take pus from a smallpox scar and scratch a child, and the child would develop smallpox, just a lighter, more localized case most of the time. And that brought your chances of dying from around 1 in 10 to maybe 1 in 20 or 1 in 50. So that farmer, Benjamin Jesty, was by all accounts sort of this cantankerous old guy, and he made an observation. Milkmaids never seemed to get smallpox, although they would occasionally get cowpox from cows. Cowpox produced similar pustules, but it was almost never fatal. Jesty made a connection between cowpox and smallpox and decided that people who had caught cowpox would never catch smallpox. So he took a knitting needle, a cow, and his wife, and he did what most of us would do. He burst a pustule on the cow and then used the dirty needle to scratch his family. Shortly afterward, the first anti-vaxxers came about in the form of Jesty's neighbors, who probably rightfully thought he was kind of odd. So the first person to study vaccination in great depth was Jenner. And as they say, the difference between doing science and screwing around is writing it down. Jenner was the first person to systematically study vaccination, even though other people had performed it before. And there was almost instant opposition. You see a political cartoon from the time where cows are bursting forth from people. People thought that by taking pus from a cow udder, there would be some kind of transfer of the bestial nature of the cow to the human, and that might make them burst forth with horns and udders. There was also opposition to the idea that a piece of folk wisdom learned from milkmaids could be turned into a medical treatment. At the time, medicine was the domain of the wealthy. Jesty thought that brought the case for vaccination before the royal court and convinced aristocrats of its value. Now, this is another cartoon from the era. After vaccination was introduced, the proportion of deaths due to smallpox dropped quite rapidly, and people started to forget about it. As vaccination was studied and became more widespread, so did its opposition. That opposition was tied into social class, different ideas about individual liberties, individual and collective rights, and changing ideas about health and medicine. The Vaccination Act of 1853 marked some of the first organized opposition to vaccination, as vaccination was made mandatory. Anti-vaccine activists organized and published pamphlets, they had meetings, and conducted letter-writing campaigns. The Anti-Compulsory Vaccination League formed in 1866 and spread to over 100 chapters, leading to a march with over 100,000 attendees in Leicester. In 1885, a mob of several thousand people rioted in Montreal against mandatory vaccination, followed by an outbreak of smallpox. In 1904, in Brazil, there were vaccine riots where 30 people died and over 100 people were injured, followed shortly thereafter by an outbreak of smallpox. In 1921, Mahatma Gandhi wrote against vaccination, believing it to be what he called a barbarous practice. During the development of the polio vaccine and the lead up to that development, there were accidents that led to considerable public outrage. In the 1930s, two teams developing polio vaccines conducted human trials in which several children had allergic reactions. In the 1950s, there was the Cutter incident in which a significant amount of vaccine was improperly inactivated, leading to paralysis in a number of children. Then in 1974, a paper came out which raised an alarm about a possible risk of neurological problems following DPT vaccination. The idea that this was evidence that vaccines were dangerous was championed in a variety of ways. A parents' group in England sought a legal mechanism to receive compensation if a child was what they called injured by vaccination. In the United States, a documentary called Vaccine Roulette aired, which popularized the idea that DPT was dangerous. The anti-vaccinationism that followed led to drops in vaccination rates in several countries, followed shortly thereafter by outbreaks of whooping cough. Even though that report turned out not to be right, legally, the perception of truth can be more important than the actual scientific truth. So, of course, lawyers saw this as an opportunity. Drug manufacturers have a lot of money, and that puts targets on their backs. Number of lawsuits being filed against vaccine manufacturers was so great that the National Vaccine Injury Compensation Program had to be established to protect the supply of vaccines. All of this is to say that anti-vaccine sentiment is not a new phenomenon. When Wakefield's paper came out, it had followed a continuous stretch of anti-vaccinationism that went back hundreds of years, so people really give him too much credit. He was following in the footsteps of others who had attempted to exploit parents' fears through muddying science. A lot of the anti-vaccine sentiment that followed Wakefield has centered on the idea that the MMR vaccine could cause autism. The media response to Wakefield's paper was to tout it. From the media's perspective, a novel risk is always going to be more interesting to report on than a continued status quo. Even though the Lancet and the BMJ had published papers at the same time as that paper warning caution, as did every other person at the press conference that Wakefield had convened, the story had already been written. Then, as people investigated the possibility of a vaccine autism link again and again, negative results just weren't as interesting. So the message spread. But once Pandora's box had been opened, it was almost impossible to put everything back in. That's one of the reasons that I think scientists need to get some degree of media training. The press's interests don't always align with our interests. Sometimes they'll see us as a comfortable people to be afflicted, or stakeholders, or people representing powerful interests. The trope of the little guy standing up to big institutions is one that's hard to pass up. So what makes someone anti-vaccine? Basically, no one sees themselves as anti-science. Climate deniers see themselves as pro-science, and they just question climate change. Evolution deniers see themselves as pro-science, but are against biological science. So maybe it's wrong to call these groups anti-science. Maybe they're just wrong. But denial does fall into certain patterns. And it's important to be familiar with these patterns so that we can recognize them when they occur. At their simplest, the feature that all of these share in common is a huge delta between a consensus among scientists who study a topic and the beliefs of a group of non-scientists. Pascal Diethelm and Martin McKee identified 5 features of science denial that can help us to recognize it. The first is the use of conspiracy theories to explain the scientific consensus. In the case of anti-vaxxers, these often relate to what they call big pharma. Did you know that there is a revolving door between big pharma and the FDA? The second is the use of fake experts. Hydroxychloroquine, it's got what plants crave. Credentials aren't always a good indicator that someone is knowledgeable or right on every topic. Given the number of people working in these fields, you'll always be able to find someone with a nursing degree or a medical degree or a PhD who has fringe views. Likewise, it's common to tear down legitimate experts. The next sign of science denial is selectivity or cherry picking. It's possible to find individual papers that support almost any proposition. If you go to the literature searching for evidence to support your views, you'll find it. Likewise, you can find weak papers that disagree with your view and tear them down or attempt to discredit them. The fourth sign is the creation of moving goalposts. No matter how much research is done or can be pointed to, a science denier can always ask for some new goalpost, sometimes well after that goalpost has already been met. An example would be a science denier saying, well, I'll believe in vaccinating when there's a placebo trial. Then you show them the placebo trial, and they say, well, I'll believe when there's a saline injection control. Then you show them that, and you say, well, I need something else. Whatever the condition they're asking for is not really the point to them. The final sign of science denial is the use of logical fallacies. Logical fallacies are rhetorical mistakes in thinking and argument that we're all prone to. Pointing out logical fallacies is a way to make everyone hate you. So a logical fallacy takes the form of making an argument that's besides the point, or changing someone else's argument to something else that's easier to refute. So how does someone get so deeply committed to ideas like anti-vaccinationism? People rarely step back to fully evaluate their commitments. People will continue to buy shares in stocks after prices have dropped. Executives will continue to allocate funds to failing divisions if they were the ones who made the initial investment. Graduate students will continue to get a degree after years, despite a diminished academic job market and low pay compared to industry. One possible explanation is that people just don't like to admit when they're wrong, or people will double down on what they see as moral imperatives when they want to see themselves as moral. Or perhaps we just so value self-consistency that we'll pursue behavior that allows us to be consistent well past the point when it becomes irrational. An important factor is group membership. People will escalate commitment to the decisions of a group they belong to, even when the group's decisions fail. There's some evidence that the use of social media can lead people to become more entrenched in their viewpoints. This group polarization might have a few causes. People look for group harmony and status, so they might find that groups are easier places to share information that can be biased. So if a group discussion occurs, rather than using it as an opportunity to interrogate our beliefs, we might be using it as a source of novel arguments to support whatever we already believe, so that we can then add those arguments to our internal model. As groups become more extreme in their views, they can also tend to drive away those with more moderate views. Someone who is vaccine hesitant or just hasn't thought about vaccines that much might find themselves in a group online. Then all of these natural tendencies of humans to escalate our commitments to groups become more attached to our viewpoints start coming into play. There's a very basic truth at play that's difficult for a lab scientist like me to wrap his head around, which is that social connections are everything. So who is the typical anti-vaccine parent? What motivates someone to disregard what their pediatricians say, scientists say, public health officials say? Well, the most important thing to remember when we deal with these parents is that anti-vax parents are really concerned with being good parents. They've read all kinds of parenting books. They've probably gone to college, probably belong to a parenting group. They have to make decisions about what kind of parent they're going to be. Will their children be breast or bottle fed? Will they go to public or private school? Will they use attachment or natural parenting? Cloth or disposable diapers? Vaccinate or not vaccinate? For a lot of those decisions, they're looking at the people around them. What do their friends do? What does their cousin do? So let's put a name to them. Let's call them Jim and Jenny from Measleton, Michigan. And they just had their first kid, and one day they're in the Measleton Crunchy Moms group. And one parent says, I went to the pediatrician and they wanted to vaccinate my baby. I said no. I don't want them injecting toxins into my baby. Then another parent chimes in. My daughter is vaccine injured. After she got the MMR shot, she had a fever for 3 days and then had seizures. That's alarming, right? So what do you do? What do? They go to Google. Jim goes to Natural News and InfoWars. Jenny goes on Amazon. And now they're really getting some upsetting information. Bill Gates is trying to implant their babies with microchips. And they see all these personal stories from people who say that their children got sick right after being vaccinated. Other stories raise moral concerns, comparing physicians who vaccinate to Nazi doctors experimenting on children. There's a theory from social psychology called moral foundations theory that tries to address some of the differences in ways that people respond to different moral arguments. So different people respond more to moral concerns that deal with care or harm, fairness or loyalty, authority, or about purity. And there are anti-vaccine arguments targeted to each of these moral foundations. Jenny sees herself as more liberal, and so the arguments about vaccines harming children and about authoritarian government tactics influence her. Jim sees himself as more conservative and is also convinced by a visceral disgust at the idea of compromising his child's purity with outside chemicals, and by the authoritative white coat wearing doctors who seem to support those anti-vaccine views. So when they come to their pediatrician, Dr. Smith, with a printout of web pages and so-called alternative vaccine schedules and arguments for why they shouldn't vaccinate, they feel like they're legitimately doing the best they can for their children. They've identified a threat, and they're preventing their child from being exposed to it. So maybe Dr. Smith tries to refute their arguments at the next visit. He goes and does research and prints out his own answers and comes back, and, well, Jim and Jenny have answers for everything he said. Dr. Smith is operating from the information deficit model of science communication. It isn't that Jim and Jenny don't have information. They've gone on the internet and they've read about vaccination and maybe even read selected scientific papers. The issue is they're not being appropriately selective with what they read, and they're not contextualizing it in the way that someone from the field might. So imagine if at any stage they'd gotten better information. If someone in the Crunchy group had stepped forward with better info, or if Jim's brother had stepped in to talk to them early on as a healthcare professional. Or imagine if when they started Googling, they were directed to New Scientist or Scientific American instead of InfoWars, or if Amazon had listed pro-science books first instead of anti-vaxxer books. So what changes minds about vaccines? I've looked through the stories of a lot of people who have left the anti-vaccine movement, and when they do so, they actually face a legitimate risk. They're losing access to their social support network. And we vaccine advocates want to be good neighbors and friends who can take on some of the burden of acting as that social support network, directing people to good resources. And we want to treat Jim and Jenny with respect and kindness. We want to have two-way conversations. We want to point them to good resources and do our best to answer their questions. But ultimately, you can't change someone else's mind for them. That's something they have to do for themselves. So reading these stories, often what happens is someone decides for themselves, I want to see what the pro-vaxxers, they might call them, what they're saying, their side of things. And they'll go and find something like Dr. Offit's book, and they'll read it, and they'll see how much more depth and science there is there, and that will change their minds. So I want to sort of end the talking portion of this, addressing the idea of vaccine for SARS-CoV-2. And once a vaccine becomes available, we're going to face a second challenge: getting people to take it. Already we've seen conspiracy theories, fake experts, selectivity in the interpretation of papers, moving goalposts, and logical fallacies related to COVID-19. The more organized elements in the anti-vaccine movement notoriously are willing to glom on to current social movements to attempt to promote their own ideas, like this summer when they exploited Black Lives Matter protests to their own ends. Anywhere that a gap in trust exists between public health and officials and the public, we can expect that anti-vaxxers will try to exploit that gap. Everyone expects scientists and health professionals to advocate vaccination, but we're not just scientists or health professionals, we're people. Most of us are people. We need to learn to connect as people. And so effective immunization campaigns partner with local communities, select spokespeople who believe the same things as the people in those communities believe, and who reflect the people who are affected. And one of my fears is that the use of an emergency use authorization by the FDA for convalescent plasma and hydroxychloroquine is going to be part of the lead up to an attempt to pressure the FDA to issue an EUA for a vaccine prior to the November 3rd election. In 1976, there's a historical parallel. A vaccine was rolled out to prevent an outbreak that was predicted of a strain of the flu, and Gerald Ford very publicly supported it, was vaccinated in the Oval Office, and all just ahead of the 1976 election. And it turned out that this vaccine carried a very minuscule risk that didn't turn up in the small-scale testing. So it created what was ultimately an absolute risk of 1 in 100,000 of developing Guillain-Barré syndrome. And this incident is used to this day to justify anti-vaccine fears, and it's something we're best off not to repeat. So thank you for having me. I guess Q&A now.
Great. Thank you so much. Yeah, I want to remind people that if you do have a question, you can submit that both on Crowdcast here in the Ask a Question field at the bottom of the screen. And then also if you are watching on YouTube, you can submit a question in the chat and we'll bring it over. So I wonder if we can just begin with that same line of thought that you just ended on. It does seem like at least from my, view of the conversation, it seems like a lot of the problem is with people who are also very wary of any government involvement in their lives or any government sort of takeover. Can you talk about the history of the government's involvement in vaccinations and when they started being required, I guess particularly for in the US?
Yeah, so that's one of the fears that people have of vaccines. It seems to go back all the way to their inception and seems to be one of these repeated motifs, is people are very afraid of people of having their bodily autonomy violated by the government. And that's actually, I think, a legitimate concern. I think people should have the right to their bodily autonomy. And in the early 20th century, there was a Supreme Court case. Off the top of my head, I'm not remembering the exact reference. I think it was 1905 or 1908. And the case was someone was fined for not vaccinating. And it wanted to say that the government couldn't issue a fine for not vaccinating. And so what the Supreme Court sort of decided then was that you can't hold someone down and force them to be vaccinated. But the government can issue fines and can create incentives for vaccination. So now every state has sort of this patchwork of rules that sort of incentivize vaccination, especially among children. A lot of the time through requiring vaccination in order to enroll in school, and then in some cases allowing exemptions. So I think that's kind of how we in the U.S. ended up with part of how we ended up with our system.
Okay. I've got a question here that I think is kind of funny, but also kind of interesting. It's from Rick, and he is asking, how are the anti-vaxxers similar or different to the anti-seatbelt movement?
Well, they're both opposed to a public health measure, so that makes them similar. And seatbelts are something that that save a lot of lives, like vaccines. I think that part of the desire internally that makes people want to stand up to authority and say, you're wrong, I'm not going to follow your rules. I think that's the same. I think, and that desire comes from a lot of places. And in America, especially, we have sort of this strain of individualism that people think they can do everything on their own. People are opposed to government regulations. And these are sort of deeply held beliefs and philosophies that underlie everything from economics to how we deal with seatbelts to how we deal with vaccines. So in a lot of ways, I think they do have sort of similar genesis.
Yeah, and it seems like that sort of individual decision also is in the anti-vaxxer movement when parents feel so protective over their kids and say they want the decision to vaccinate or not to be solely the parent's decision. Is there I'm sort of paraphrasing a question here from Beth. Is there sort of a response that you would give to that? Someone who would say, well, it's the parents need to have, complete authority over whatever happens to their children.
Yeah. So there's a few things going on. First is parents do have the authority to make that decision in the United States, but they don't have the authority to make that decision and then make use of every public resource like public schools. So that child may not be vaccinated, but that doesn't necessarily give those parents the right to endanger other people's children, which is part of the risk of people not vaccinating and then going to public schools. The other thing I would like to point out is that parents have rights, and in general, it's recognized that parents have a lot of rights of decision making for their children. But children are people too, and they have rights. And so I think it's worthwhile to consider the rights of that child to not be sick. And children aren't old enough, by definition of being children, to make their own medical decisions. But so parents have a responsibility to act on behalf of their children and protect their children's rights. And so their children's rights to be healthy and protected are also worth considering.
This question is from Kimberly. She's asking, what are your thoughts on the movement towards total denial that viruses don't exist? I haven't heard of this before.
Yeah, so I'm skeptical of their claims. I haven't heard of them before, but there are people who make lots of different claims. What's interesting is currently medicine has a monopoly on the treatment of disease. And what I mean by that is that there are other ideas about how to treat disease than medicine. So there's acupuncture, there's chiropractic, there's hydropathy, there's laying on of hands, there's faith healing. And so societally, we recognize that science-based medicine and evidence-based medicine are what has been most effective at treating disease. And people resent that monopoly, and just like they resent the monopoly science has on arriving at new information. So I think part of that resentment can lead people down pathways toward beliefs that from the outside seem irrational, but internally can make sense to the person who holds them. Now, that all of that being said, you can use an electron microscope and look at a virus.
Let's see. So this question is from Carolyn. I'm just going to read it verbatim. She says, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, but know some, and in some ways can see why one could become an anti-vaxxer if you don't have confidence in the federal government. Aside from the president, what entities, scientific or otherwise, have the most credibility in terms of vaccine approval?
Right. So under normal circumstances, and I don't know that we're currently under normal circumstances, Normal circumstances, I would say CDC and FDA, usually very good sources of information. There are committees within the federal government that are tasked with approving biologics and vaccines. And so those committees have scientists and, yes, some industry people on them, and they look at data and decide if it justifies something being seen as safe. And these committees are generally composed of scientists who are respected by their peer scientists. And that's, in a lot of the time, how I personally would assess someone's credibility. So if it's a vaccinologist who is respected by other vaccinologists, it's likely that they're going to give me good information. But maybe if they're a vaccinologist who does not have the respect of other vaccinologists, I should be skeptical, because I'm not a vaccinologist. So I have to use cues like that to try and determine who is a real expert and who is and who isn't.
Yeah. This next one's from Laurel, and she is asking, what would we see? She's concerned about the rush to create a vaccine for COVID. What would we see as hints that a coronavirus vaccine was too rushed to be safe? I saw a couple news items today. One that said these 9 drug companies were going to pledge that they wouldn't submit a vaccine as a candidate for review until their safety was shown in clinical trials. But do you think that's enough? Yeah.
Oh, sorry, finish.
The other article that I saw was that AstraZeneca said that they're going to pause their trials because of an unexplained illness, and I just thought, oh, this is maybe too much information that we have. Maybe we shouldn't know this. The only thing that's going to do is cause more fear, and maybe that,
Well, I think it's good that they're being transparent about that point. One of the unfortunate things, I think, is that so far we haven't seen a lot of data. We've seen a lot of press releases and statements from CEOs, and I don't know how much I believe that. A press release is not the same as a peer-reviewed publication. I want to see peer-reviewed publications. I think Dr. Fauci will be a canary in the coal mine. I think that Anthony Fauci, director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Disease, I think he would resign before allowing something unsafe to be approved. I think that there are other scientists who would have sufficient integrity to resign before that happened. Now, that being said, if there were sufficient data today to approve something, then so many people are dying that there's an ethical imperative to help them as quickly as possible. And that's what UAs are intended for, is if there's sufficient data to approve something, but not quite enough to meet the normal requirements, but maybe you can continue studying it as it's rolled out or something. That's what an EUA would be used for. Realistically, it doesn't appear that any of the major candidates are far enough along that I would trust them before November. So if you take a look at what happened in Russia recently, a vaccine candidate was approved based on, now that the study has been released, I think a decent trial, but with only 76 people. And like I was just talking about, where that flu vaccine was expanded to a large group of people without enough testing. There are things that can appear in tens of millions or hundreds of millions of people that aren't going to appear in 76 people. So, so what I think needs to happen is peer-reviewed publications that scientists can evaluate.
Let's see. I want to ask this one just because it's been voted on quite a few times. It's from Thatcher. And he says, we have good friends that we just found out during the pandemic are very much anti-vaxxers and are spreading a lot of dubious information via social media. I think a lot of us have seen that. We have completely cut them out of our lives. However, is there a way to attempt from our side to have a rational discussion with them on the topic, or is it just to wait and see if they come around through their own explorations?
Yeah, that's tough. So the book and talk are titled "How to Challenge a Misinformed Movement," and then I think it's kind of disappointing that I'm not giving you the magic formula that you write down this equation and you tap your head 3 times, and then everyone around you becomes a believer in vaccination. And I'm not sure that that is something that can exist. I do think that if I've had friends who became anti-vaxxers as well, and I think I made more progress with them through having 2-way conversations where I listened to their point of view and then shared my point of view and then went back and forth. When I watched the movie Vaxxed, I watched it with a friend who was an anti-vaxxer, and at the end I asked her about her opinions of it, and she had a very different take than mine, and we both sort of shared our views and why we viewed them. And I think it didn't convince her, it didn't change her mind necessarily, but I think it gave her pause. And so if I had just said, no, you're wrong, and stopped talking to her, I wouldn't have made that progress. Now, some people, you really just can't change their minds. They're just entrenched, right? A lot of us have noticed that over the last 4 years, is that some people have some views that are very strong that we disagree with, that we wish we could change. But like I said, ultimately, you can't reach into someone's brain and start messing around and fix them. You have to help them and create a safe and social environment for them to change themselves.
This question is from Haley. She says, someone close to me has decided to pursue an alternative vaccine schedule for their children. The family is not anti-vax per se, but is cautious around vaccines. I have no idea if it's worth it for me to have a conversation with this person, or if the risk is nil, and if the risk is nil with an alternative vaccine schedule. And that kind of ties, actually, if I can just throw this other one, and it kind of ties into this next question from Beth, which is she knows some people who are against bundling immunizations rather than offering them singly and spreading them out more.
So I think that the best vaccination schedule is the one offered by the CDC, and having a delayed schedule is better than no schedule. But the reasons that people choose delayed schedules are, in general, I would say, not good reasons. I have not been able to find a benefit to a delayed schedule, and there is a risk with a delayed schedule. The risk being that the child will contract or transmit a disease in the time when they have not been vaccinated. So there have been cases of children who didn't receive their measles vaccine, and then they were on a delayed schedule, and then they passed it, and they were fine, but they passed it to an infant younger sibling, and that sibling died or became very, very ill. and that's the risk of doing the delayed schedules. So I think it's up to you and your relationship with that person. If it were me, I would probably just I'm kind of non-confrontational, so I would probably not address it head on. I would probably write a book about it, or or if they were talking to me about it, you know, I wouldn't withhold my opinion. Tell them I don't think there's a benefit to doing this, and I think there are risks.
Yeah, and I just referring back to the last question too, I think we have seen that social media conversations tend to not actually help or go very far. This question is from Bob, and he is asking, are there any other issues with something like herd immunity? Perhaps related to the seatbelt question, are state laws requiring drivers to carry auto insurance, providing a likelihood that you won't get hit by an uninsured driver?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
I think, yeah, well, I my estimation of it is that he's, well, when he's talking about insurance, it makes me think that he is talking about all of us getting a vaccine, but that doesn't,
So
it's the possibility that that we would contract whatever virus is being fought there.
maybe I can talk a little bit about herd immunity, and then maybe that in doing that I'll address the question.
Yeah.
So the idea of herd immunity is, say you have a population of 1,000 people, and you have a vaccine that is 95% effective, and you give it, and out of that 95% effective, you give it to 900 people. So what's 95% of 900? I can't do math on my head. 0.95 times 900. It's 855 people are now immune. And that means in that population, there are 145 people who are not immune. And some of those people who are not immune are people who were vaccinated because vaccines are only so effective. But if you imagine someone walking around in this population and they are not immune, and they encounter 5 people in a day. If you have those 855 people who are immune, their likelihood of encountering someone who's not immune and is infected is much lower. And if you are one of the people who's unvaccinated, one of those 100, your likelihood of encountering someone who's not vaccinated and is infected are much lower. So what herd immunity is, it's this mathematical criterion that says at a certain percentage of the population for a vaccine with a certain effectiveness, then endemic transmission will end, meaning the average number of people that an infection will be transmitted to from a person will drop below 1, and then eventually the number of cases will taper off. So with something like a vaccine for SARS-CoV-2, we don't need to vaccinate every single person, and the vaccine doesn't have to have 100% effectiveness. We need to vaccinate enough people with effective enough vaccines that when outbreaks do occur, they can't continue to propagate in the population.
I heard this prediction recently, and actually it wasn't that recently, I guess it's maybe a month ago, that someone was predicting that we would have sort of a vaccinated class, that we may in the future end up with people who are vaccinated, and those are preferred people for jobs and other things, and then have all the others that aren't. And you know, just with timing, that seems like a possible situation where some are and some aren't because it's just not available yet. Do you think that scenario has any merit, and how do you think that might affect, either hurt or help, any kind of anti-vaxxer movement?
So, well, first of all, vaccines tend to be pretty cheap to produce, which is good, because it allows large portions of the population to be immunized. Which is the negative to that, I guess, is that they're not very profitable for pharmaceutical companies, which is why it takes about 10 years on average to bring a new vaccine to market. Now there's all this interest, and there's over 100 vaccines in the pipeline for SARS-CoV-2. We're going to have a multi-chapter story rolling out SARS-CoV-2 vaccines. So some are going to be approved, another is going to be improved, and they're each going to have different profiles, and different availabilities and different rollout times that are going to overlap. And I think most likely what will happen is, if there's limited availability, it will first go to frontline healthcare workers, and then people who have a lot of uncontrolled interactions with the public, so firefighters, maybe police officers. And then as more vaccine becomes available, then more people will have access to it.
Great. Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of who might be prioritized.
Tend not to. I haven't heard of a vaccine being approved only for some people. There's usually a barrier in the form of cost. But so I'm saying it'll be rolled out to those groups first. I mean, it will become available, and then those will be the groups that are recommended at first get it.
Interesting. Well, I guess we will see what happens with that. Jonathan, thank you so much for this presentation. It's been very interesting. I know a lot of people feel very strongly about this topic, so thanks for bringing some humor to it and bringing your insights.
Thank you.
And thank you all so much for watching. I want to encourage you to purchase Jonathan's book through the link on your live stream page. That's going to take you right to Elliott Bay Books, where you can purchase it locally. If you'd like to watch more Town Hall content, you can follow this Crowdcast channel by clicking the follow button in the top right corner. You can also check out our calendar for upcoming events. We have a pretty busy fall schedule. Thank you again, Jonathan, and I hope that everybody has a great night.